Are you? There we go. Okay. All right. So good evening, everybody. Thank you for your patience with playing with YouTube and live stream and whatnot. So okay. What I want to talk about tonight is in our last topic on Jewish perspectives on leadership. And I think I think the point is pretty clear about what we're saying about leadership within the context of what's going on in America right now. And I'll leave it to all of you and everybody watching to come to their own conclusions about what we think about leadership, people running for office in this country, a race in Alabama for Senate that is happening right now, and what this has to do with the leadership. So that's why I wanted to. That's an element of why I wanted to look at Abraham, Moses, and Amos for our lessons, rather than have a free-flowing discussion about politics. So, because that can go everywhere, and perhaps we're preaching to the choir anyway. But I think it's important to put this all in context, and especially in light of that Senate race, to put it in light in a religious context, to be a counterpoint to that so-called religious perspective that's going on in that race right now. So we looked at Abraham, we looked at Moses, we looked at the prophet Amos in Hebrew, Amos, and we learned some basic concepts about what a leader is meant to be from the Jewish tradition, and how the rabbis understand the lessons taught in the Bible itself. So you're supposed to live a life of values as Abraham, Moses, and the prophet Amos did. You're supposed to stand up and advocate for justice. You are supposed to criticize authority when justice is not being followed through, when idolatry is taking place, and that's what the prophet Amos was arguing about. But you can extrapolate from that idea. When you see any kind of wrongdoing, you're supposed to criticize it, not sit back. So these are some of the basic values that we're learning about what a leader is supposed to do. And what I want to look at this evening is what Maimonides has to say about this. Now, Maimonides was one of the greatest rabbis in Jewish history. He was born in Spain in the late 1100s, at a time when Spain was both Christian and Muslim, and he was born in the Muslim part of Spain at a time when the Christians were starting to make a push down. So Christians were coming from the north, the Muslims had come from the south. Muslims had entire Spain, but then Christians came down from the north. So anyway, Maimonides was born into a family in Cordoba, in Spain. You go to Cordoba today, you'll find a statue of Maimonides still there. I haven't been there, but that's what they say, that statue is there. Those of us who went to Hebrew school growing up and remember getting a blue notebook that said Machberet on it, which is Hebrew for notebook, would remember a face on the front of that blue Machberet. That face is Maimonides' face. Why that happened with that Machberet, the company that produced that blue book. So those of us been to college before computers know when you take an exam in college, you were given a blue book. Oh, they still give out a blue book? Okay. My kids, I don't know. Do they have blue? Some of it they do on the computer. Some of it, there's some remote control that they have. I don't know. Anyway, so those blue books. So the Hebrew school edition of the blue book, and also it's in Jewish day schools too. Again, I don't know if it's still today, is this picture of a man with a turban, and that's Maimonides. So born in Cordoba, moved with his family to Morocco, and then moved to Egypt. So safe, relatively speaking, historically, for Jews to live in the Muslim empire. There was anti-Semitism, of course, in the Muslim empire, but certainly life for Jews is a lot better under Muslim rule than under Christian rule. So Maimonides is known for 3 books, 2 more than at age 20, he wrote a commentary to the Mishnah. That's not the most popular of all his books, but that's quite the accomplishment to write a commentary to the Mishnah, which is the first collection of rabbinic literature, 6 volumes of Jewish law edited 1,800 years ago. Then at age 40, he wrote the summary of Jewish law known as the Mishneh Torah. Mishneh Torah is also how the rabbis refer to Deuteronomy, like a repetition of the Torah or a summary of the Torah. So that's how Maimonides took it, 14 volumes. So that's why some people call it the Yad, Yud, Dalet. Hebrew letters have a numeric equivalent. The letter Yud, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, 1 through 10. Yud is 10, Dalet is 4, 14. That's why sometimes his Mishneh Torah is called the Yad, traditionally published in 14 volumes. It's like the Reader's Digest edition of Jewish law, and rabbis at the time criticized Maimonides. How dare you making life easy for Jews today by summarizing Jewish law, taking away the tradition of needing to study the entire Bible, the entire Mishnah, the entire Talmud. Why would people do that when they have your Mishneh Torah? So some rabbis criticized it, some rabbis burned it, other rabbis commented on it, and a traditional edition of the Mishneh Torah, which I have here as one of the volumes, shows, you see the Hebrew. I'm showing it on the camera, and it's reversed. You see his text. His text is here in the middle, and you got commentaries on either side and on the bottom of the page. Rabbis in different generations. He was a Sephardic rabbi, a rabbi of Spain, and the Muslim Empire is of the Sephardic tradition. His main commentator is Avraham of Poskier. And rabbis who might be watching this, and my professors, I apologize for not remembering exactly, but it's from the Provence. And Provence was Ashkenazi. So a little bit after the time of Maimonides, he's called the Ra'avad, but he's known by his abbreviation. So it's like Maimonides is known by his abbreviation, the Rambam. So that's when he was 40. And when he was 60, he wrote a philosophic treatise called The Guide to the Perplexed. He wrote the commentary to the Mishnah, and his Mishneh Torah he wrote in Hebrew. The Guide to the Perplexed he wrote in Arabic as a work of philosophy for those who are perplexed, those who are seeking a way, those who might be questioning religious life in general. So he wrote to the secular Jew and wrote to to Arabs as well, writing in Arabic to try to reach out to as many people as possible. People still study the Guide to the Perplexed today, which was very much influenced by Aristotle as well. So, not talking about Aristotle, not talking about the summary of the commentary to the Mishnah, his Mishneh Torah. His summary of Jewish law made it easier for people to know what to do in a particular circumstance. So you might not have to go to your rabbi to figure out what the law is about a particular situation. You can just open the Mishneh Torah. When 300 years later, there was a summary of Jewish law known as the Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Joseph Caro, Sephardic rabbi in Israel, used the Rambam and two other works as the basis for writing the Shulchan Aruch. People still study the Mishnah Torah today and when you study Talmud in the traditional way in Hebrew, the traditional text of the Talmud will have footnotes in the text itself referring to the law, and you can follow the development of the law by it referring to where it's found in the Mishnah Torah and then where it's found in the Shulchan Aruch. So these are major works that guide Jewish religious life today, Jewish observant life today, those elements within the Jewish community that care about observing Jewish law have to care about Maimonides and the work on the Mishnah Torah. So not only was it a practical guide for life today, Maimonides also included a section, he included sections that deal with the future, so that there is something prophetic or hopeful in his summary of Jewish law, in that he included laws pertaining to sacrifices, which you do not find in the Talmud, meaning that he's hoping for the day when the temple would be rebuilt. And when it is rebuilt, sacrifices are going to be restored and the sacrificial system will be restored. And you have to remember how to offer the sacrifices, because by Maimonides' time, already sacrifices haven't been offered for 1,100 years. That's already ages and ages where people just don't remember. And so he wrote it down so in other words, when we pray 3 times a day, we pray for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, so some of us might gloss over it. The state of Israel is established. It's celebrating its 70th birthday in 2018. Israel will be 70 years old. Major milestone. And so that's what we should be happy about. Right? So we have the state of Israel already. So what is this about wanting the temple to be rebuilt? What does that even mean? Do we really want sacrifices to be, that sacrificial system to be restored? Haven't we gone beyond that? Isn't that barbaric to want to pray for sacrifices? So Maimonides is saying, no, not only do we need to have a practical guide for how to pray the prayers, how to light candles, and how to observe Passover and all that stuff, but he's also saying, not only are we praying for the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem, I'm going to remind you what the laws are, because I'm really serious about this, and that means you, dear reader of my summary of Jewish law, to be a good Jew, you have to be believing in the restoration of the temple and wanting the sacrifices to be restored as well. So that's number one, that he includes all the laws pertaining to sacrifices. And number two, which is even more significant, which pertains to what we're going to be looking at this evening, is that he includes laws pertaining to the kings of Israel. So that is the very last section in his summary of Jewish law, which highlights the idea of looking forward to the future. So not only is it about the sacrificial system and looking at it from a religious perspective, that we remember our past, we study the Torah, we read the Torah every week, we're reminded of sacrifices in certain prayer books, not in the conservative prayer book, but in Orthodox prayer books. There is a lengthy section dealing with sacrifices that are included in the preliminary service every morning. So we don't have that in our conservative movement prayer book, and certainly it's not in a Reform and Reconstructionist prayer book either. But in Orthodox prayer book, you have that, sacrifices. So the restoration of the temple is not just a religious thing. By including the laws on kings, it's a political thing as well. In other words, so for Maimonides, this summary of Jewish law includes a section on it when we return to Israel. It's not if. When we return to Israel and the Messiah comes to herald our return, then there's going to be a king in Israel who is descended from King David, and these are the laws that pertain to that king that will be followed, and this is how the king will conduct himself. And he makes it very clear in chapter 1 of this section. There's no queen, it's a king. So I'm not being sexist. He is, so there will be a king, and this is how the king is supposed to conduct himself. So so his work on the summary of Jewish law then becomes a spiritual treatise, not just a practical guide, right? So today our practical guide for any answer is Google. So he was the Google of his day by coming up with the Mishnah Torah, but it's more than that. It's as if people worship Google. Okay, I'm sure there's some people who do. I'm not one of them. What?
Knows everything.
And Google knows everything. Yes, it's the Almighty. It's the all-knowing, but it is human-made, and it only knows as much as the information that's plugged into the system. So we just have to keep that in mind. So Google knows things, but Google can be hacked. Unlike God, God can't be hacked. And what in other words, what Maimonides does with his Mishnah Torah provides a very important lesson that when you study his book, you are studying from a particular religious perspective that always looks forward to the Jewish people being restored to its land under Jewish sovereignty. Okay, so now it might be. So it's difficult for us to understand. So there are a couple people in this room who were alive before the state of Israel was established. But most Jews today don't remember a time when there wasn't a state of Israel. So it's hard for us today to understand the religious longing that is evident in his book and other books throughout history until 1948. Every traditional Jewish book until 1948 has as a component some relationship to a desire to be back in the land of Israel. Okay, so today we take the state of Israel for granted. There's even talk that Saudi Arabia wants to make peace with Israel. There's talk. I mean, if you look on Times of Israel, the past couple of days, there was an article about Saudi Arabia is forcing the Palestinians to accept a peace plan with Israel so that then Saudi Arabia will normalize relations with Israel to have a larger bloc to be anti-Iran. Okay, so for whatever reason, we'll take it. We'll take it. If Saudi Arabia is willing to make peace with Israel, can you imagine what kind of birthday present that will be for Israel for its 70th birthday? Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So we take all of this for granted, but we have to put ourselves in the mind of Rambam and in the context of 800 years ago. Jews, for the most part, in the world as it was known, were living under persecution, if not threat of death, every single day. So if you're living your life that way, it's kind of hard to find a reason to get up in the morning and to be happy about life. And you can imagine then the hope that this life will end pretty quick so that we can imagine some other kind of life. So perhaps that's a message that Maimonides is including in his book too. Don't worry, dear Jewish friends. If we keep praying hard enough, if we are observant enough, our prayers will be answered and we'll be restored to the land of Israel. Okay, so what does he say? Any questions or comments so far? Yes, Saul.
Was there any talk when Israel was established of having a monarchy?
Oh, was any talk?
As opposed to, a British type
Right. So is any talk about restoring the monarchy? So that was a whole debate within the Zionist community at the time. There were those who were anti-Zionist for two reasons. One, they were anti-Zionist because we live in America. We live in Germany. We need to express our support to our government, and that's how we express our Judaism today, by being totally assimilated and showing total loyalty to the country in which we live. It would be treasonous for us to support a state of Israel today, or a cause for the state of, or for a future state of Israel. She left her phone. So that's why one segment of the Jewish community was anti-Zionist, because they feared for how those Jews who would be supporting an establishment of state would be treated within their own country. The others were anti-Zionist, a small religious group, because we can't be Zionist. It's not up to us to determine the establishment of a state in Israel. It's up to the Messiah to come to do that. And we have to wait for the Messiah to come. So there are ultra-Orthodox Jews who live in Israel who are anti-Israel. This ultra-Orthodox group called the Neturei Karta, which is Aramaic for guardians of the city, they are so anti-Israel that they were Jewish advisors to Yasser Arafat, and had gone to Iran also to provide support to them, because they thought that the state of Israel is inhibiting the coming of the Messiah, because Jews should not be pushing God and taking upon themselves the right to establish a state. So they are in Israel, they are in the land of Israel, because it's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel, but it's an abomination and heresy to support the state of Israel. So
I've heard of those that won't go to Israel until the Messiah comes.
Maybe there are some who won't go to Israel until the Messiah comes. I'm not so sure about that. Everybody agrees it's a mitzvah to visit the land of Israel. The land of Israel. That is the earth of Israel, as opposed to supporting the state of it. Most mainline Orthodox Jews today are staunchly Zionist and staunchly supporters of the state of Israel. It's only within the ultra-Orthodox community that you find people who are not supporters of the state of Israel. So that's why nobody would wanted to restore a monarchy, because first of all, the monarchy has to be, according to Jewish tradition, a descendant of King David. And only the Messiah is going to know who the descendant of King David is. Okay, so just a side note, and I've said this before, this is why in the Christian Bible, Jesus is the genealogy of Jesus is descended from David. Because if Jesus is the Messiah, and Jesus was Jewish, and his first followers were Jewish, and he was preaching to the Jewish community, he had to prove, or his followers had to prove, that he was descended from David. So how to prove that around the year 0, 2,000 years ago, which was nearly 600 years after, 500 years after the exile, the last king there was a last king of Israel, so of Judah, who's descended from David. So how do you prove that even back then, let alone today? So it would be a miracle to find someone who is the Messiah, who is descended from King David. So we have to wait until that day comes to see who that descendant is. So that's why there was never a talk about instituting a monarchy. The only talk was what kind of form of government we were going to have. We being Israel. It's an American form of democracy, British form of democracy. They adopted the British form because That's what they were living under, the British Mandate from 1917 to 1948. So that's the system that they were aware of, and they were living under. Just easier to transition on May 15th, 1948, when the British left. You have the system is already in place, the courts and everything like that. Back to any other questions or comments about Maimonides and the context for Maimonides in this section. So, there is a translation which you can Google, the translation of the final chapter of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, which is translated as Laws of Kings and Wars by Reuven Bronner, copyright 2012, from a town in Israel, Ra'anana, Israel. So I'll show it up here on the screen for people to see. This is the source for this. It's up there long enough you can copy that down. Okay, so what I wanted to look at is chapter 2, which focuses on these laws of kings, because this has the information that we need to get a sense of what the rabbis, because the Rambam isn't making this up himself. He's deriving his summary of Jewish law based on rabbinic literature that came before him. And it's also based on the Torah. So Deuteronomy chapter 17 discusses when you enter the land of Israel and you want to establish a king for yourselves, then this is what you have to do. Okay? And in fact, I should have the Chumash here, so I apologize to those who are watching. I'm going to disappear for a moment while I go to the back of the chapel to get a Chumash. Okay, here I am. So looking at a Chumash, the Eitz Chaim, Deuteronomy chapter 17 is from the portion Shoftim, I believe, yes. And here it is. Right. Just one second. It's from verse 14 in chapter 17. If, after you have entered the land that the Lord your God has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me as do all the nations about me, you shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. Okay, so in other words, the people decide they want to have a king, God's going to then decide who that king will be. Okay, and that's how it plays out in the book of Samuel. Okay, there are 2 books of Samuel. So Samuel, that when the Israelites entered the land of Israel, Joshua brought them into the land, led the conquest, and then after he died, there were a series of judges for about 200 years that kind of continued the conquest. And then Samuel was this transition from the last judge to the first king. And the people came to Samuel, it's time now, we want to have a king just like everybody else, which is what it says here. That you shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. So Samuel says, okay, let me discuss this with God. And God says, choose Saul. So Saul's the first king. So be sure to set as a king over yourself, one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kinsman. Okay, so the king of Israel has to be an Israelite. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses, or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. Since the Lord has warned you, you must not go back that way again. And he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray. Nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. When he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. Let it remain with him, and let him read in it all his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, to observe faithfully every word of this teaching, as well as these laws. Thus he will not act haughtily toward his fellows or deviate from the instruction to the right or to the left, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. So, from this section, what kind of characteristics are important for a king to exhibit? Can't be greedy or can't be seeking wealth. Yes. What? Humility. How is the humility expressed? What is more important than the king, or what book is more? The God. So God and the Torah, right? So not only does he have to live according to the Torah, just like everybody else, but what else does he have to do with the Torah? Well, yes. Okay, we'll get there in a second. He has to write a Torah. He has to write his own. Has to have his own copy of the Torah. And then, along with the wealth, the silver and the gold, is not having too many horses. And he can't go back to Egypt to get more horses either.
So the importance was ruling, speaking for the people, and not accumulating fame and wealth for himself.
That's right. Ruling the people according to be of ruling the people, be of the people. And not be seeking fame and fortune. Okay, so now that's been a problem. Well, if we read the Bible, all of the Book of Kings, that's the problem with most of the kings in the 500 years or 400 to 500 years that there are kings of Israel. That you can count on one hand the righteous ones who actually followed through on this. And we know one for sure, Yehoash, who actually finds a copy of a book of the Torah in the temple and ensures that the temple gets restored because there were idols had been placed in it by his predecessor, and restores the temple to Israelite worship. So again, you can count on one hand those kings who actually did follow through on this and who were who lived life according to the Torah. So I just want to highlight what Maimonides says about this. So again, seeing chapter 17, verses 14 through 20 as the model for this. So this is some of what Maimonides elaborates on these ideas. The king should get his hair cut every day. He grooms himself and adorns himself in resplendent garments. As it says in Isaiah, your eyes shall gaze upon the king in his beauty. The king sits on a throne in his palace, and he wears a crown on his head. The entire nation comes to him when he wants and stands before him and bows to the ground. Now, the Torah doesn't say that. And in fact, the Torah might imply that you need to be humble. Certainly not. There's nothing about having a palace, nothing about sitting on a throne. Okay, perhaps the Torah takes that for granted, that if the people want a king, you're going to get a king. So then if you're going to have a king, the king has to be like other kings around you. So if other kings have a palace, other kings have a throne, then an Israelite king is going to have that too. So Maimonides takes that and then uses another verse from somewhere else in the Bible, Isaiah chapter 33, your eyes shall gaze upon the king in his beauty. Okay, so the king has to look nice every day. So there's got to be a royal barber. So there are some people, I've never, even when I had hair, I never got a haircut every day, but there are some people who do that in order to be perfectly groomed and manicured. Okay, and so tailored garments and whatnot, that's what, so that could make you feel pretty good about yourself if you're getting a haircut every day, and most people are getting a haircut once a year, maybe at this time. If you're getting a haircut every day, okay, you're automatically setting yourself apart. And then, so the idea that the entire nation comes to him when he wants and stands before him and bows to the ground. So the king has the right to call people for an assembly or whatnot, and they and he should expect people to bow down to him. Okay, even a prophet, he goes on in chapter 2, number 6, even a prophet stands before the king and bows to the ground, as it says, behold, Nathan the prophet, and he came in before the king and bowed down to the king with his face to the ground. This is from 1 Kings chapter 1. However, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, does not appear before the king unless he wants to, nor does he stand before him. Rather, the king stands before the Kohen Gadol, as it says, and he stood before Eleazar the Kohen, from Numbers chapter 27. Nevertheless, the Kohen Gadol is commanded to honor the king. He seats him, stands before him when he comes to him. The king should not stand before him unless he is there to ask of the Urim. Okay, so 2 things about this. One is, there is one person more important than a king, and that's the Kohen Gadol. Okay, that's according to Maimonides. And the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, represents God on earth, because the Kohen Gadol represents all of the worship service that happens every day, all day, in the temple in Jerusalem. So the Kohen Gadol is God's representative on earth, and is the embodiment of the Torah, because the laws of sacrifice are found in the Torah, and that's the Kohen Gadol. And so the king only shows, is humbled before the Kohen Gadol. And then the number 2 here is about there to ask of the Urim. So this is an element that's reflected in the Torah. There are these stones called the Urim and Tumim. In fact, Urim and Tumim is what's written on the seal of Yale University. Okay, so if you look at the Hebrew letters on this, Google seal of Yale University, you will see Hebrew on that seal. And it says Urim and Tumim. Okay, Hebrew words which are from that. So the Urim and Tumim are like the oracle, what you seek for truth, to get the answer. Okay, the founding fathers who established Harvard and Yale, right? Aren't those the first 2 universities in America? I think Harvard definitely was the first one, 1630s. Yale, don't know when. Okay, I'm not a graduate of Yale. I don't know. So, but it's before the Revolution. Those schools, Harvard definitely had Hebrew as part of the standard curriculum, part of the core curriculum. To be a graduate of Harvard, you needed to be fluent in Hebrew. Okay? In fact, there are some founding fathers who wanted Hebrew to be an official language of the United States. So, fascinating stuff. Anyway, because the founding fathers, Protestant, saw the Hebrew language as an authentic language, or an ancient religious sacred language. So, anyway, the Urim and Tumim are these stones that are to be consulted if you go to war. And those stones would tell you, and Kohen Gadol knew how to read them, it would ask, should we wage a war now against such and such? And the Urim and Tumim somehow would give an answer. So the Kohen, the king, in deciding to go to war, so this gets into a whole other element. There's Milchemet Chovah, an obligatory war, which according to the Torah is conquest of the land of Israel, and Milchemet Reshut, an optional war, which is not about the conquest of the land of Israel. So King David was involved in both. And so under King David, the borders of the land of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, were the biggest it ever was. It went beyond Damascus in the northeast. It went over the Jordan River and south, way down to Eilat. And Solomon expanded it a little bit. Solomon expanded the empire down to Ethiopia and through the Arabian Sea. Anyway, all those wars of part of that conquest are called Milchemet Reshut, optional wars, and supposedly the Urim and Tumim would have to be consulted in order to wage that war. So what we're learning from this Mishnah is that important for our perspectives on leadership, that the leader, the ultimate leader, one would think is the king. It's not. It's the Kohen Gadol. And in fact, one would more rightly say, or technically say, it's both Kohen Gadol and king together to represent both the secular and religious aspects of running the country. The next Mishnah, to highlight this point, the king must give honor to those who study Torah. When the Sanhedrin and the sages of Israel enter, he must stand for them, and he seats them by his side. So did Asa, king of Judah, do when he stood up from his throne for a Torah scholar and kissed him and called him my rabbi and my teacher. Okay, so this alludes to something in the book of Kings, and some reference there of King Asa reflecting, calling somebody my rabbi, my teacher. There were no rabbis at the time of those kings of Israel. The rabbis projected back, and they said, if we have a Sanhedrin, they must have had a Sanhedrin also, in order to show to the Jews at the time that the rabbis are not creating their system from scratch. They wanted to prove through references that they found in the Bible that their system really existed way back when. So even though they instituted the Sanhedrin, this court of 70 sages, they wanted to prove that that Sanhedrin existed back in the time of the kings as well. So they're saying the king has to pay respect to the rabbis as well. Okay, so if there's no temple, even if there is a temple, the rabbis also. So there's a triumvirate: the king, the Kohen Gadol, and the rabbis. So the next statement is, this applies when the king is at home alone with only his servants present, and he does this and similar things privately. But in public before the people, he does not do this. Then he stands for no one and does not speak gently and does not call anyone but by his name. This is so that reverence for him will fill the hearts of all. So privately, he shows respect for the Kohen Gadol and to the rabbis. Publicly, you got to put up appearances and be formal about it. The king is supposed to be the one. In the same way that the scriptures has given him great honor, and everyone is obliged to give him honor, so has he been commanded to be of a subdued and unpretentious heart, as it says, and my heart is empty within me. He must not act overly haughty towards Israel, as it says, lest his heart become haughty over his brothers. So it's kind of hard not to be haughty when you're getting a haircut every day, you're wearing the finest clothes possible, and everybody's bowing down to you. Okay? It's kind of hard not to let that go to your head. Okay? But he's commanded to act that way. He cannot let things go to his head.
This is his interpretation.
This is his interpretation, but it says here in the Torah, thus he will not act haughtily toward his fellows or deviate from the instruction, that is the Torah, to the right or to the left. Okay, so the Torah says that he cannot be haughty.
Well,
Maimonides is emphasizing that point. Yes.
That. But before we got to this, he did mention that there was supposed to be a king like the nations around you.
Right.
Today, the nations around us don't have kings. Well, maybe some do, but they have parliaments. And Maimonides was only a little bit short of King John, of the 1280, what was it?
Magna Carta.
The Magna Carta. He was only a little bit short of that.
Right.
So.
Okay, so Julian raises a good point. If the Torah says a king, just like every other place has a king, today there aren't that many kings around, but there are parliaments around. The same would apply to whatever political system is out there, and you want to establish your own political system, it should be according to Jewish guidelines. Okay, so if in other political systems you have scandals going on, that doesn't mean that you should have scandals too. No, I'm just saying that, in other words, if it's okay for people in other forms of government to abuse power, right? I mean, we just saw in Zimbabwe today.
It's not Jewish, though.
But that's the point, Julian. So the point is to ensure that we don't be like the other nations. If they have abuse of power, their political leaders abuse power, act haughtily, are greedy. Just look at most of the African nations and most Arab nations, that where the leaders of those nations have abused their power and have robbed the banks of their nation for their own personal gain. That is what the Torah says a king of Israel should not do, and by extension, what a political leader of Israel should not do. Yes, Perry.
All I hear you saying is that the king of Israel was really a secular leader.
Yes.
Endowed or told to act a certain way, but he could not amass money.
Right.
So he was a commoner, but commanded respect in all other ways. And then you had the priest who led.
So Perry is saying, so he was a commoner, commanded respect, but not to amass wealth, with a caveat that Maimonides says he's allowed to get a haircut every day. How is he going to afford that? And where's he going? He says later that the king's allowed to institute taxes for the maintenance of the royal court. So, but you can't have excess. There are certain things that is expected of the king to have, right? In other words, we expect the president to live in the White House, to have a chef, full-time chef, and to have state dinners and all of that, but not go to excess. Who defines the excess? Okay, so there's a system in place of checks and balances, right? The people do, theoretically. Congress and Senate oversee the White House, and usually whatever requests come from the White House for state dinners, for new china, for new decorations are usually approved. And the Christmas tree that gets cut down in Wisconsin and travel across the country to put up in front of the White House. Okay, so all these things are part of the budget that you and I pay for in our taxes to have a system of government so that the president, no matter who the president is, can be the most can exhibit and represent the most powerful seat in the world. Yes, Marie.
What Maimonides is describing, just in a historical context, based on what you read and explained, is very much like any Western medieval king in his own setting, and in theory, operating in theory, as you described, and the Kohen Gadol is very similar in relationship to the Pope. The difference is that I'm hearing, and here's my question, is that the king always retained a religiosity about him, even though he wasn't the Pope.
Right.
And he always claimed that in every charter and anything else, gratia Dei, by grace of God. So there was always a claim that there's a direct relationship of the grace of God to the king.
Right.
So there's a relationship with the corporate priest. So I know that there's the choice of the king in relation to God and ancestry. So what in terms of relationship and formula would there be for that relationship?
Okay, so Marie is pointing out historically the relationship of kings of Europe to the Pope. So we're talking about Christian Europe, and that the kings of Europe also had as their charter by grace of God written in to their charter, and so they have a divine element about them as well. So yes, Maimonides is well aware of that, living under kings of Spain, of Christian Spain, and even though he's from Muslim Spain, well aware of how business is conducted in the world of his time. And so part of this is a critique of how Christian Europe and the kings of Christian Europe conduct business, and that how corrupt Christian Europe is, and how blasphemous, you might say, it is as well, when you're looking at exactly how the kings are supposed to conduct their affairs and how they are supposed to be subservient to a religious law that is above them, and how they're supposed to be, but they're not. So yes. So Maimonides, you could say, and I'm not a historian, but I'm sure historians would put this within the context of the time and see this partially as a critique of the relationship of the king and the pope. So what we have, there are elements of Catholic of Catholicism that are related to the Bible. I mean, just the vestments that the Catholic priests wear and the Pope wear are related to what is described in the book of Exodus. So, so what Maimonides is pointing out is that and he has the freedom to do this because there are no kings of Israel. He's saying, if there were kings of Israel, we'd be a lot better than you, because this is how we would do it, and we'd be so moral and so humble and so honest in our relationship to the Bible. Would that be the case? I don't know, but this is Maimonides projecting what it is. So again, there's a balancing act that the king of Israel has to do between the expected appurtenances of his office that he's supposed to have versus being humble, which is very, very hard to do. Okay, so hark back to Jimmy Carter when he was president of the United States. And he didn't want to have these state dinners, and he didn't want to waste the country's money, right? From the little bit I remember from Jimmy Carter's time, people criticized him for that. How dare you do that? You have to have these state dinners. You got to wear a tuxedo. That's what it means to be president of the United States. Don't be ashamed of it. Flaunt it. Make people realize that you are the most powerful man in the world. So people critiqued him, whereas Jimmy Carter, and he wanted to be Jimmy, just a peanut farmer from Georgia, just wanted to maintain his humility in office. So that was his person, because he was a very devout Christian. He wanted to maintain that element within his office, and how difficult it was for him to do that. So you give him credit for wanting to maintain his humility. We can criticize his politics another time if you want, but I don't want to do that. But the idea of wanting to be humble in office is a very, very difficult thing to do. But this is what Maimonides is trying to do. Just one or two other things I want to share before time runs out. From chapter 3, he says, when the king sits on the throne of his monarchy, he must write a Sefer Torah, a scroll of the Torah, for himself. This in addition to the Sifrei Torah, the scrolls of Torah, which were left for him by his forefathers. Right? If every king writes a Torah, there's going to be a bunch of Torahs in the palace. He checks his Sefer, his scroll, against the one in the temple courtyard in accordance with the Court of 71. Right? So there has to be a master text by which you are writing your Torah. Okay, so every scribe who writes a Torah today has a master text that they're writing from. Okay, so this is a fascinating thing too. So it's not just you have to be conversant and knowledgeable of Jewish law. You have to represent that by writing a Torah. Okay, and the fact that you're going to spend the time writing the Torah shows how much that's supposed to enter into your being as you're writing it. Because to write a Torah, you have to be focused. You have to make sure you're doing it correctly. You're looking at every single word. You're reading the word out loud before, and then writing it, and then reading it again. And you're comparing it to the other Torah that you're using as your model. So you can't help but talk about and study what you're writing. Okay, so you're being totally conversant in the Torah itself, and ideally, it's supposed to impact the king so that the king feels something in the process, feels spiritually, religiously, that he's doing something important. And that adds to the humility that is supposed to enter into his office. Okay, he must not accumulate many horses, as we learned in the Torah, but only as many as he needs for his chariots. He may not even have one spare horse to trot before him, as is done before other kings. If he adds horses, he is given stripes. That is, he would be lashed. That would be his punishment. The king would be lashed. That's right. What? Well, how about adding wives? So we're not gonna have time to get to that one. But this is the horses. You have as many horses as you need for your chariots. You can't have any extra. How many chariots do you need? Who knows? But you have your military advisors to tell you how many chariots you need. You have one extra, then you get lashed. He must not amass too much silver and gold for his treasury in order to be proud about it or for his enjoyment. He may only have as much as he needs to pay his soldiers, servants, and attendants. However, it is a mitzvah to increase the coffers of the temple treasury. Any extra silver and gold is to be ready for use for the public needs and their wars. The prohibition only forbids him from increasing his own wealth in his own treasury, as it says, and he shall not increase for himself. He is given lashes if he increases his riches. So, right, past president of the United States can take advantage of being past president of the United States and become quite wealthy people, right? But then again, as a past president, but we pay for their Secret Service detail, we pay pension for them, and they go off and make a ton of money. What?
And sometimes do good.
And yes, I'm not denigrating that. And most of the time, I look at the same Jimmy Carter, still building houses, Habitat for Humanity. He's 90-something years old. Good for him. And and the presidents come together. They were just together in Houston, raising money for rebuilding Houston. So good for that. Good for them, and good for their efforts. But again, just to highlight again, so to summarize in the minute or two that we have left, the idea here of why I decided to study this particular perspective in this fashion is just for us to recognize that when we're talking about Jewish perspectives of leadership, that it's much easier to have a discussion based on the texts and texts from our tradition rather than critique current political leaders. So the 4 weeks itself can be a subconscious, subtle critique of leaders today. And I guess let me ask this question: how realistic is it to have leaders act in this way? Is it legitimate to question a leader about whether the leader is as moral and ethical and guided by religious tenets? Is that a legitimate question to ask of leaders today?
It is, because it is a standard that should be strived for, that we have a right to expect. To the extent that we want to allow those standards to slip, that's our choice.
So Perry is suggesting there that it's appropriate to have these standards. But what about if a leader has particular religious standards that go against your religious standards, right? So you think back to Kennedy. People questioning, can there be a Catholic president of the United States? Because when the Catholic president, defer to the Pope and not be a leader in his own right, right? Then Kennedy have a lot to do, and Mitt Romney had to do the same thing about his Mormon religion.
Many of those, of the Catholic leaders have not been overbearing on abortion.
Okay, I'm just saying, so, I'm just so Perry is saying, about those very same those political leaders who happen to be Catholic might be pro-abortion,
Not pro.
not tolerate the law and not wanting to change the law, the Supreme Court ruling. So again, so there's a danger. You see the inherent risk in saying that a leader should follow his religious perspective when there is not uniformity of religious perspective, right? So you could say, well, they should follow the Ten Commandments, but not even that. There's different translations of the Ten Commandments too. So, do we need our political leaders to believe in God? And what the threat is of a belief in God in a political leader, because there are some religious people who take the so-called Word of God literally, and there are others, as we see from our Jewish perspective, that we don't take the Word of God literally. The process of being Jewish is to constantly interpret. So there is no such thing as those who claim within the Jewish community that they're being Torah true. There is no such thing. Don't be swayed by that phrasing of Torah true Jew, because it's propaganda and it's not right. There is no such thing, because the rabbis themselves interpreted the Torah, and we continue to interpret the Torah today. So there is no true. There is a truth for our generation and how we interpret it today, but it is not the truth. So what I'm saying is it's difficult to apply these perspectives fully today. But there should be some standards that we expect our political leaders to uphold, certain moral, ethical values that we expect them to uphold, that everyone will agree are those moral and ethical values. And depending on the generation, those values change, right? So people from the 1700s, the presidents of the United States who owned slaves, who we revere today as founding fathers of our nation, we wouldn't imagine voting for them today because our values have changed. So anyway, any other thoughts or comments before we conclude the class? Yes, Adriana. Is it necessary to have a kingdom before the Messiah comes? Now, Messiah comes first. In the order of things, the Messiah will come, and the Messiah himself is the future king. The Messiah literally means anointed one. So the Messiah is the descendant of King David. Will be led in on a white horse through the Mount of Olives into the city of Jerusalem, and thus herald this new age and the rebuilding of the temple and the establishment of the kingdom in Israel. That is what we pray for. That is our vision of the future. That is kind of like what Olam Haba is, the hereafter that we talk about. So until then, it's just waiting for that time to come, if it will ever come. So Maimonides is talking about how this king will conduct affairs when the Messiah comes and the kingdom is reestablished. This is how it will work. So who knows? But this is how it will work. So in other words, the time of the Messiah is supposed to be this idyllic time when everybody follows the law. There is no jealousy. There is no competition. Everybody will be pure and perfect. And so then you don't have to worry about needing to be humble, because it will be inherent in our nature at that time. So I guess that's the final comment about these perspectives on leadership, that it's sometimes maybe it seems as if it's setting the bar too high. But perhaps we have the bar high there so that we can always be criticizing and encouraging our leaders to follow particular values. And so when we write letters to our congressmen and senators, when we protest certain things that happen in our country, which we should, we need to have this as a guide and to show our leaders as to what we expect of them. All right. So have a good night, everybody.
So next week.
Next week is Thanksgiving, and there's no more class.
So as we sat here, I got a news flash: 2 more women accused Judge Moore.
2 more. So now it's up to 8?
7, I think.
Oh, 7. I heard 1 today.
I heard there's
Number
2
6.
ones at the mall or something.
Okay.
But I figured out, God is incorporeal and omnipotent.